Hi, I'm Elira. At my own family's fundraiser, my sister leaned in and whispered to security, "She's a fraud. Don't let her through." Then she turned to me and hissed, "You'll humiliate us again. Stay outside and watch the car." They thought I'd just nod, just vanish. But what they didn't know? I was the one who built the very foundation they were standing on, and when my husband walked in, the one no one even knew I had, well, let's just say, their faces turned the color of fear. Before we dive in, what would you have done if your own blood locked you out of a life you helped create? Tell me in the comments. I read everyone. The sun had just begun to dip behind the city skyline when I pulled into the lot beside the hotel. The fundraiser was in full swing already. I could see the shimmer of champagne flutes through the glass walls, the silhouettes of gowns that cost more than my monthly rent. I stepped out of my second-hand Camry, smoothing down the creases of my navy blue dress. It wasn't designer, but it was mine. I'd saved for it. As I walked toward the entrance, heels clicking softly on the concrete, I could already feel it. That heaviness in my chest. Like I was walking into a place I once belonged, but now wasn't welcome. Not really. Not since Emma had risen to her social peak and decided I was an embarrassment. Still, I came. Because this event used to mean something to me. Back when I'd helped design the flyers, stuff envelopes late at night. Back when Emma and I used to share dreams over instant coffee in our dorm room. Back before she decided I didn't fit the image she'd built. The red carpet shimmered like spilled rubies ahead of me, and then, there she was, Emma, perfect hair swept up, a gown that probably had its own zip code. Her smile, practiced and photogenic, faltered the moment she saw me. "Oh," she said, striding over with a kind of stiff grace. "You're actually here?" I smiled. "You invited me." Her eyes flicked toward the cameras, then to the doorman. She stepped closer. "Stay outside and watch the car," she hissed, her breath sharp against my cheek. "Don't make this another scene." "What?" My voice barely rose above a whisper. "You'll humiliate us again," she said, eyes cold. "Don't act surprised. You don't belong here anymore, Madeline." I felt my stomach knot. But before I could respond, she turned, gesturing to a tall man in a security jacket standing just beyond the velvet ropes. "That's her," Emma whispered loudly, faking concern. "She's not well. She crashed our last family event. Please don't let her in." The man blinked. His eyes moved between us. "Ma'am." "I'm going to need you to wait over here," he said, stepping in front of me, one hand raised politely, but firmly. Guests nearby turned. I felt their eyes, the pity, the judgment. Someone laughed, a dry, low chuckle that might as well have been a slap. "Who let that in?" a woman in red muttered. Emma had already walked away, her smile back in place, welcoming the mayor's wife as though nothing had happened. I stood frozen, then turned. I walked back toward the parking lot, my heels suddenly too loud, echoing with every heartbeat, each step heavier than the last. The Camry's door creaked softly as I opened it. I sat, carefully, like I might crack under my own weight. I didn't cry. I stared at the wheel. My hands trembled slightly on my lap, but I didn't cry. I was past that. I leaned my head against the seat and closed my eyes. And just like that, I was 17 again, at our old church's fundraiser. I'd spent a week designing flyers, our youth group's annual gala. Emma was chair that year. When the pastor asked who had created the invitation, she'd smiled and said, "Just a little something I threw together." I hadn't said anything, just nodded when someone complimented her on the layout. Even then, I'd been the quiet one, the invisible piece that helped the puzzle shine, but never got framed. I thought it would change, thought adulthood would mean respect, equality, but it hadn't. It had just made the rejection more expensive. And public. A knock on my window jolted me. I looked up, heart skipping, but it was just the parking attendant, nodding at me to say I was okay to stay. I nodded back. As he walked off, I finally reached for my phone. One message blinked on the screen. "We're 5 minutes away. Wait for me." No name. But I knew who it was. A small smile tugged at the corner of my mouth. Let them laugh. Let them sip champagne and talk about legacy and investments under gold chandeliers. They wouldn't be laughing for long. I leaned back in my seat, eyes fixed on the front door of that glittering hotel, and whispered to no one, "This time, I'm not the one being dismissed. I waited in that cold car, watching them clink glasses under chandeliers, until the Blacktown car pulled up beside me. The clinking of glasses echoed faintly through the trees as I sat in my car, engine off, coat draped over my knees. My sister's laughter rang out, sharp, polished, hollow. I stared out across the asphalt, watching headlights trace lazy lines across the driveway. Guests arriving fashionably late, with perfect teeth and rehearsed grins. Then it appeared. The town car pulled up smooth as breath, its headlights casting long shadows across the hood of my old sedan. It parked beside me, but unlike the others, the door didn't swing open for a showy reveal. Instead, the tinted window slid down quietly, and a voice I knew better than my own said, "You ready?" I turned. He wasn't wearing the tailored suit I was used to seeing him in at board meetings or when we'd slip away to quiet art shows in the city. No silk tie, no cufflinks, just a navy sweater, pressed slacks, and that steady look in his eyes, like the world could spin off its axis, and he'd still find my hand in the dark. He didn't say anything else right away. He didn't need to. The look in his eyes held all the weight I hadn't allowed myself to feel until that moment. I opened my door and sat sideways, legs still inside, fingers gripping the edge of the seat. "You didn't have to come," I said, voice low. "You shouldn't be seen with me tonight." He gave a short laugh, gentle but amused. "Seen with you? You're the only person I came to see." I looked at him and exhaled through my nose, something between a sigh and a question. "They don't know," I said. "Not who you are, not what you do. They still think you're—" He nodded. "An underpaid research analyst who got lucky with a biotech fund 10 years ago? I know." And I wanted to keep it that way. My voice was tighter than I'd meant it to be. "I didn't want to walk into a room like this and have people respect me because of you. I wanted them to see me." His eyes didn't waver. And tonight? They didn't. The silence stretched between us for a moment. Then, he leaned slightly toward the center console and held up a small white rectangle, a name badge, already printed and laminated. "R. Callahan," it read, "Global Health Donor." I raised an eyebrow. "That's your mother's last name." He smiled. "No one ever checks when the money clears." My jaw twitched. "You went inside?" I did. Just before sunset. Walked the full ballroom, shook hands with half the board. No one looked twice. "Your name isn't on the guest list. Your sister made sure of that. She even told one of the organizers that you've been emotionally unpredictable." I swallowed that down. Of course she had. That's how she always got away with everything. You label someone unstable and the world gives you a free pass to be cruel. He turned slightly in his seat. "I also made a sizable donation earlier this week, under the Callahan name." I looked at him, not sure where this was going. "It guarantees me a seat at the head table tonight," he said. Quiet and even. The seat they thought was reserved for the silent foundation donor from the East Coast. I blinked. He continued, "It's yours." My breath caught. "You did that for me?" "No," he said, voice low. "I did it for the version of you who still hopes they'll ever give you credit for the work you've done, for the heart you've shown, and for the version who's slowly realizing she doesn't need their permission to be present in the room." I sat back in the seat, letting his words settle around me like warmth. A memory bubbled up from nowhere, our wedding day, a library room in a coastal inn, just the two of us and a clerk who forgot her reading glasses. No grand entrances, no camera flashes, just quiet vows and a whispered promise to keep our love out of the spotlight. "I asked you back then not to flaunt anything," I murmured. "Not your name, not your money. I didn't want to be the woman who married up." "You aren't," he said, steady. "You're the woman who built everything despite them trying to bury you." Outside the windshield, the last rays of dusk had faded. The fundraiser lights spilled through the frosted windows of the mansion. Music wafted through the cracks in the glass. Somewhere inside, my sister was probably spinning a story about how I was too unstable to attend, how I embarrassed the family, how I was best left in the shadows. But here, in the dark warmth of this parked car, someone saw me. Fully. Clearly. He reached over, took my hand gently, and placed the name badge in my palm. "Let them figure it out," he said softly. "Let them sit there wondering how you got that seat." I stared at the plastic rectangle. The name wasn't mine. but the presence would be. I hesitated, not out of fear, but out of the deep ache that came from being told your whole life you didn't belong. That voice doesn't leave easily, Lee. But then I thought of the years I stayed silent, of all the times I watered down my opinions at meetings because my sister was in the room, of the family holidays where I was handed a folding chair while others sat on velvet cushions. I nodded. He opened the door for me, stepping out first. The cold air rushed in, bracing and clean. I wrapped my scarf tighter around my neck and followed. As we crossed the lot together, his pace never rushed, his hand never leaving the small of my back, I felt something shift, not in them, but in me. Not shame, not bitterness, just clarity. I adjusted my scarf as we neared the steps. The heels I'd worn all night, though practical, suddenly felt too loud against the pavement. Every crunch on the gravel seemed to echo what I already knew. This entrance wasn't made for people like me. But tonight, I didn't walk alone. He offered his arm quietly, like he always had when the world wasn't watching. No dramatics, no claims, just presence. We reached the start of the red carpet. Someone near the valet booth looked up. I could hear a woman whisper, "Is that... who's he with?" A man in a tailored suit turned toward us and did a double take, then another. I didn't flinch. I kept walking. I let them squint. The same security guard from earlier, the one who'd waved my sister's friends in without a glance, stood upright this time. When we stepped within arm's length, he didn't ask for a name, didn't block the door. He stepped aside, held it open. Inside, the lobby gleamed like a movie set. Marble floors, hanging orchids, gold-framed portraits of past benefactors, and a chandelier so large it looked like it had its own zip code. Classical music poured from a live quartet tucked behind silk curtains. I could see the ballroom now, just beyond the arched entry. Laughter, toasts, tinkling glass. A curated crowd that had no memory of the girl who used to serve them mini quiches at these very events. The moment I stepped into view, a silence broke the rhythm. Not full, but sharp enough to notice. Conversation staggered. Forks froze mid-air. One of the board members' wives tilted her head in surprise, as if trying to place me in a photo she didn't remember posing for. And then, there she was. My sister. Still holding her champagne glass mid-toast, surrounded by a cluster of people who'd never asked what happened to me. Her smile was picture-perfect, frozen in an angle that didn't quite reach her eyes. We didn't walk toward her. I nodded politely at no one in particular, as if my presence were routine. Expected, even. That alone shifted the room's tone. And then, someone tapped the mic. "Ladies and gentlemen," the event host's voice boomed. "A brief moment, please." The room hushed. "We are thrilled to announce a new generous pledge made just this evening from a longtime supporter of global health initiatives, Mr. R. Callahan." A wave of applause rose up, but before anything could be clarified, my sister took a bold step forward, glass still in hand, voice syrupy. "On behalf of our family," she began, gesturing vaguely toward the crowd behind her, "we are deeply honored. This evening's about legacy, and we've always believed in giving back. Truly, it's what our parents instilled in us." A few people clapped again, but the pause afterward was long enough to notice. I didn't move. Beside me, my husband exhaled softly. Not a sigh, just amused patience. The clapping stopped when 3 board members made their way toward us. They bypassed my sister entirely. The first, a man I remembered from years ago, older now, still in suspenders, reached for my hand. "It's been too long," he said warmly. "I'm glad you're here tonight. We were hoping you'd attend." The woman beside him chimed in, her accent clipped and polished. "And so kind of your husband to make the donation, especially requesting it be done in your name. That was a beautiful touch." I smiled. Subtle. Measured. Behind them, my sister's expression began to crack at the corners. The kind of slip you only see when someone forgets they're still being watched. One more board member approached, a tall woman I'd once interned under. "You've grown into yourself," she said simply. "We've missed your voice." It wasn't a compliment. It was a correction. My sister's friends looked between us, eyes darting. No one spoke to her now. No one asked her to elaborate on her family's contribution, and yet she stood there, her glass trembling just slightly, watching her story slip away in front of her. I felt his hand brush mine. "Let them enjoy this moment," he whispered gently. "The next hour will be more revealing." I gave the smallest nod. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't even redemption. It was restoration. And as I stepped forward past the circle of those who once rewrote me out of their memory, I felt no urge to gloat, only to reclaim. She stood still as I walked past her, no longer the forgotten one in the corner. I placed my hand on the back of the chair she once told me I'd never earn. Her smile cracked, just a little. I walked past her and placed my hand on the chair she once told me I'd never earn. I didn't rush. I pulled it back gently, letting the legs whisper across the polished floor. My husband was right behind me, his hand resting briefly at the small of my back before he took the seat beside mine. We didn't say a word. We didn't need to. The head table curved like a crescent moon at the front of the hall, overlooking rows of round tables where other guests were settling in. At our end, crystal glasses glimmered under the chandeliers, and the scent of truffle oil floated from silver-domed plates being carried in. I could feel eyes on me, curious, unsure, but silent. Not hostile, not like before. More like they were trying to reconcile something that no longer fit their old picture. To my right, a soft click. One of the event photographers had taken a candid shot. No one stopped them. No one asked me to move. My sister, Clarissa, sat 3 seats away, far enough that she couldn't pretend it was coincidence. She was perched beside a local bank director and someone from the Historical Society, faces I vaguely remembered from years of newsletters I was never included in. Her expression was neutral. But she held her champagne glass a little too tightly. I hadn't even touched mine. Dinner began with a butternut squash bisque, ladled into fine china. It was warm and spiced, but my appetite was mostly absent. My fingers toyed with the edge of my napkin until a quiet voice from across the table broke the silence. "You probably don't remember me," the woman said, leaning forward slightly. "But I remember you." She had a calm, steady gaze. Her name tag read, Janet Llewellyn, Advisory Board. She looked to be in her early 70s, with elegant silver hair swept into a twist and a voice like soft linen. "I was at the original clinic site on Harrison Elm," she said. "You used to come in late with armfuls of flyers. You were the one who started the community schedule calendar, weren't you?" I blinked, caught off guard, then nodded. "Yes, that was a long time ago." Janet smiled. "I thought so. I always wondered what happened to you." My stomach tensed. She set down her spoon. "Back then it was you and your sister, but when the clinic was rolled into the Ames Foundation, I only ever saw her name listed. You just disappeared." My lips parted, but I couldn't find the right thing to say. I felt my husband glance over, alert but silent. "You started that flyer program, didn't you?" Janet continued. "And the evening health seminars for single parents?" "I did," I finally said. My voice was quiet, but steady. "But I wasn't invited to be part of the new board when they transitioned. I found out through a press release." Janet's brow furrowed. "That's strange. I remember asking about you once. Someone said you'd moved away, that you weren't interested anymore." I gave a tight smile. Someone must have really wanted me out of the story. And someone had. Clarissa. It hit me again, that buried truth. I had stayed up night after night, typing proposals, designing handouts, chasing donors. Clarissa barely showed up to planning meetings. But when the family decided to consolidate everything under one umbrella, the Ames Foundation, she'd taken the reins, quietly, strategically, and I, the sister with the messy bun and printer-stained fingers, had been edited out like a footnote. Janet shook her head slowly. History isn't supposed to be rewritten that way. But it had been. Fully, and cleanly. I glanced down at my plate, untouched, and for a moment, I was no longer at a glittering fundraiser in a designer dress. I was back in that tiny back room of the old clinic, surrounded by piles of pamphlets and volunteer sign-up sheets. I saw myself then, exhausted, hopeful, and too trusting. Clarissa had smiled when I handed her a thumb drive of all our presentation files. "You're the best," she'd said. Seriously, none of this would exist without you. The next week, they filed the incorporation paperwork, with her as the sole founder. I hadn't fought it, not then, not out loud. I told myself I was just behind the scenes. I let them believe I didn't care about credit, but it hadn't been true. Not entirely. I came back to the present with a slow breath. The room was louder now, more guests laughing, clinking glasses, leaning in to hear one another. But my focus had narrowed to Janet's kind eyes, and the space Clarissa had carefully carved me out of. My husband reached for my hand under the table. I looked at him and he gave the smallest nod. "You ready to say something tonight?" he asked softly. I didn't answer right away. I looked around the head table, the board members, the sponsors, the people who still thought they knew what this night was about. "Not everything," I said finally. "Just enough to start the shift." He smiled. "That's all it takes." At the far end of the ballroom, I saw the event organizer rising with the mic again, glancing toward me. I stood slowly as they handed me the mic, not as a guest, not as a sister, but as someone they thought they buried. I adjusted the mic gently, and for a moment, the only sound in the room was the soft clink of silverware being hurriedly set down. A few guests froze mid-sip. The chandeliers above us flickered slightly, not from power, but tension. I didn't need to clear my throat. My voice came, low but certain, and the silence helped carry it to the corners of the ballroom. "Thank you," I began, "for having me tonight. I know many of you don't know who I am, and that's all right. I've known this cause since it was nothing more than a sketch on the back of a grocery receipt, written while my son was teething and the soup was burning." A couple chuckles escaped from the front rows, mostly polite. My eyes didn't drift to her. Not yet. I've known this cause in its most vulnerable state. I've known it when we couldn't afford toner, when we printed health flyers at home and hand-delivered them to clinics that barely had chairs. I've driven through flooded roads, walked up icy porches, and sat across from mothers too tired to speak but desperate for someone to listen. Behind me, I could feel my sister stiffen, the same way she used to when she thought the spotlight might shift. "I never minded being the one in the background," I said, pausing. "What mattered to me was that someone got a checkup they couldn't afford, that a grandmother in the valley got her insulin, that a child could see a doctor before school started. The name behind the paper didn't matter. But it did. We all knew it." "And yet," I continued slowly, "when the foundation launched, when the funding came through and the building went up, my name was nowhere. Not in the charter, not in the paperwork, not in the opening ceremony, not even in the internal emails. And I let it go." The pause this time wasn't for effect. It was for breath, for control, because even after all these years, saying it out loud felt like pushing a rock uphill with bare hands. I told myself it didn't matter, that being part of the mission was enough, that family meant more than credit. Someone coughed sharply. Another shifted uncomfortably in their seat. I caught a glimpse of an older woman near the end of the table. Janet, I remembered, nodding ever so slightly, like she'd been waiting years to hear this. "But eventually," I said, "silence starts to feel like consent," and I realized I was no longer being humble. I was being erased. A few murmurs now. I could sense my sister wanting to interject, but the decorum of the setting, and maybe the fear of what else I might say, kept her seated. Her wine glass remained untouched. Her eyes, though, burned through me. "And about that national award your board often references," I added, letting the words settle. I co-authored that submission. I wrote the metrics. I did the footwork. I formatted it until 3 a.m. while my son slept on the couch next to me. The envelope was addressed to both of us. A few gasps. More than a few turned their heads toward her now. I didn't move. But when the award was announced, I said, only one name was read, and it wasn't a typo. I let that hang in the air, not long, just enough. "I never asked for a stage," I said, softer now. "I didn't want applause or flowers or framed certificates. I just didn't want to be buried alive by the people who once clapped for me in private and erased me in public." Silence returned, but this time it felt heavy, almost holy. Then a single clap, Janet again, then another, somewhere near the far end of the ballroom, then a few more. The applause didn't come like a wave. It came like steady rain, quiet, persistent, cleansing. I didn't smile. I didn't look down. I kept my eyes ahead as I finished. I never needed the stage, but I won't be erased again. I set the microphone down gently on the podium. The feedback buzzed faintly and cut off. As I turned, I heard it, soft, from the back. She was the real founder all along. The ballroom behind me pulsed with soft jazz and muffled applause, but I barely heard it. My fingers still tingled from the weight of the mic. I stepped out into the corridor, heels tapping against polished marble, the cool air outside the ballroom hitting my skin like a wake-up slap. I just needed 5 minutes to breathe. But I wasn't alone. From the shadowed archway to my left, a familiar voice emerged, low, clipped, and bitter. "You really couldn't let me have tonight?" I turned. She was leaning against the wall like she'd been waiting, her lipstick still perfect, but her eyes wild. I didn't answer right away. I folded my arms, holding the silence like a mirror. "Answer me," she snapped. "You planned this, didn't you?" "No," I said quietly. "But I stopped letting you pretend I was never here." Her mouth curled. "You always had that tone, like you were better than the rest of us." "I never thought that," I replied. "But I stopped pretending mediocrity was kindness." That struck a nerve. She straightened and stepped toward me, voice rising. "Do you even understand what it was like living in your shadow? Even when you were gone, they still compared everything I did to what you might have done. You were the one who erased me," I said. "I didn't ask to be the ghost you couldn't ignore." She exhaled harshly, eyes glinting. "I deleted your name from the foundation docs, okay? The day before the launch. I opened the file and just backspaced it out, because I couldn't stand one more person saying, 'Oh, but your sister—'" There it was. I stood motionless as the hallway dimmed around her confession, like the walls themselves were listening. "And the award?" I asked, though I already knew. Her voice dropped to a mutter. "That application packet? It had both our names, but I rewrote it, told them you'd moved overseas and cut contact. They believed me." I blinked once. "You really didn't think I'd find out?" "I prayed you never would," she whispered, "because you being gone was the only time I could breathe." Just then, footsteps echoed behind us. We both turned. It was our mother. She'd heard everything. I saw it in her face. No shock. Just the tired resignation of someone who'd known for too long. "Mom," I said, stepping back slightly, "did you know?" She didn't rush to answer. Her eyes dropped to the floor. "I suspected," she said softly. "I didn't want to believe it at first. But then, I saw how the foundation launch photos had no trace of you. I knew your writing style, your ideas. I stayed quiet." I swallowed. "Why?" She glanced at my sister, then back at me. "Because she needed the spotlight more than you did." The words cracked something in me. Not loud, not violent, just the quiet splitting of a dam that had held for too long. "You let her erase me," I said, my voice trembling now. "You knew and you let it happen." "She was struggling," my mother insisted. "She always felt invisible next to you. I thought you'd be fine. You always land on your feet." "And I did," I said, bitterness sharpening each syllable. "But not because of you. Not because of either of you." Neither spoke. For the first time, they looked small to me, not cruel, just deeply flawed. "We thought," my sister muttered, "you didn't need the credit." That was it. That was the final blade to the heart. I looked from one to the other. So I was expendable, convenient to forget, convenient to cut. My mother's lips parted as if to defend herself, then closed again. Nothing came. I exhaled slowly, willing my knees not to buckle. But I wouldn't fall, not here, not for them. "I want nothing from either of you anymore," I said, steady and sure. "Not your explanations, not your guilt. Keep your spotlight." I turned away. The ballroom came back into view, warm lights, clinking glasses, oblivious laughter. As I stepped into the room, I straightened my back. I didn't need to shout to be heard anymore. I walked through the crowd, past the board members, past the curious stares, past the family name I no longer carried like a burden. I didn't need them to clap. I didn't need them to know. I just needed to walk away intact. And as I crossed the parquet floor, I felt it again. Freedom. It didn't come with applause. It came in silence, in the absence of needing to prove anything at all. By the time I got home that night, the sky had gone ink black, and the porch light flickered the way it always did when the wind picked up. I stepped inside, dropped my purse by the door, and exhaled like I'd been holding my breath all my life. I didn't turn on the lights right away. Instead, I made my way through the dark, familiar with every creak in the floorboards, every misplaced tile in the hallway. In the back room, my old home office, I found the box. The one I hadn't touched in years. Tucked behind filing cabinets and Christmas decorations, covered in a light film of dust, like it had been waiting in silence for this moment. I carried it into the office, shut the door behind me, and turned on the desk lamp. The light spilled across the folder labels, the curled corners, the ink-smudged tabs I'd made with highlighters and sticky notes a decade ago, back when everything felt raw and hopeful, back when we still sat at kitchen tables arguing over grant language and community outreach. I pulled out one manila folder marked Bylaws, Original Filing. Inside were handwritten notes, drafts with margin edits, and finally, a stamped, notarized copy of our founding agreement for the health initiative. My name. Her name. Equal shares. Equal voice. Both listed as co-founders, filed and accepted by the state health registry. Sealed, signed. They hadn't removed me. They'd just changed the branding, rebranded it with new stationery, a flashier name, and a photo of her standing solo in front of a mural we'd painted together in a church basement. But legally? I still held co-founder status of the original nonprofit. I sat back in the chair, fingers resting on the edge of the paper. All those nights I'd thought I was crazy. All the times I'd doubted myself, thinking maybe I'd never meant that much to the mission. Maybe they were right, but here it was, in ink and law. I had never disappeared. They just buried me under fresh paint. The next morning I scanned everything and emailed it to Julian, a friend from law school who now specialized in nonprofit trusts. We hadn't spoken in years, but his reply came back within the hour. Subject line, "They can't erase you, and this gives you options." His message was brief, but I read it 5 times. Options. It wasn't revenge I wanted. It was recognition, integrity. And after what happened at the gala, I finally had the strength to claim it without needing their permission. 2 days later, Julian called. "There's someone I'd like you to meet," he said. "Private donor rep, old client of mine, discreet, but powerful." He didn't elaborate much, just told me to show up at the Riverwalk Club, 8 a.m. sharp. So I did. I wore a dark blazer, no jewelry, hair pulled back. The lobby of the club was quiet at that hour, polished floors, quiet chatter, servers carrying trays of black coffee and buttered toast. I was guided to a table tucked into a corner overlooking the lake. There sat a woman about 10 years older than me, dressed simply but deliberately, gray cashmere sweater, no name tag, no introductions, just an envelope on the table. She gestured for me to sit. "You don't need to explain anything," she said calmly. "I've followed the trajectory of the foundation for years, and I know who wrote the early wellness education model. That wasn't your sister." I kept my expression neutral. "No, it wasn't. I also know the latest PR stunts and social posts she's put out are, let's say, inconsistent with the mission's roots. Donor's notice." She opened the envelope. Inside was a draft agreement. "If you're ready," she said, "we're prepared to reallocate next year's major grant, $3.2 million, to an entity under your leadership, something closer to the founding values." I blinked. "That's a big move." "We're not doing this to punish your sister," she said, sipping her tea. "We're doing it to protect a mission we care about. We're asking you to step forward, not just legally but publicly, as the original co-founder. We'll handle the legal messaging, but we want your name back on the door." I didn't answer right away. I looked out the window. The lake shimmered under the morning light. Somewhere across the water, families were probably getting ready for school, retirees walking their dogs, bakery shops just unlocking their doors. And here I was, not out for vengeance, but standing at the edge of something real. "Why me?" I asked finally. She gave a small smile. "Because you built it, and you still believe in it." I closed the folder, careful, precise. "I'll do it," I said. "Not to spite anyone, but to honor what we started. After the meeting, I walked out onto the balcony of the club. The sun was higher now, warm on my face. The city buzzed beneath me, cars inching across intersections, the river glinting in gold. I leaned on the railing, letting it sink in. I wasn't trying to reclaim what they took. I was building something new from what they tried to erase. Julian sent the notice that evening to the board of the foundation, attaching the documents, the bylaws, the original filings, and a formal declaration of my intent to relaunch the initiative independently, under its original name, mission, and co-founder structure. He copied their general counsel, and their PR contact. My sister would read it. Maybe tonight, maybe with wine in hand and excuses already forming, but that wasn't my concern anymore. This time I didn't need to knock on their door. This time they were going to hear mine slam shut. The email confirmation had been simple. Please join us for the quarterly update meeting, board and founding members in attendance. Nothing more. No acknowledgement of the document I had sent, no response from the board, but the silence didn't unsettle me anymore. It prepared me. That morning, I walked into the glass conference room of the foundation headquarters 15 minutes early. The long walnut table, polished to a mirror shine, caught the slant of morning sun. I chose a seat midway down the left side, strategic, visible but not at the head. That seat wasn't mine. Not yet. One by one, the board members entered. Janet with her gray shawl, Mr. Whitaker with his ever-present fountain pen, even Lisa, the donor liaison who used to call me the quieter one. Their smiles were polite, thinly veiled curiosity lining their eyes. No one asked why I was there. They knew. Or sensed. 5 minutes past the hour, the glass door clicked open. Lorelei walked in like a storm bottled into a suit, navy blue, tailored sharp enough to slice. Her heels clicked like punctuation marks across the floor. Her eyes scanned the room and locked onto me. "You don't belong here," she hissed, voice just above a whisper, as she passed behind my chair. I didn't flinch. Instead, I calmly slid the notarized co-founder document across the polished table toward the center. "I'm here by invitation," I said simply, my voice steady. "And by right." The chairwoman cleared her throat and motioned for the meeting to begin. As the opening remarks stumbled through generic donor statistics and glossy marketing updates, I stayed silent, watching Lorelei control the pace with a practiced smile. She stood at the touchscreen monitor, walking the room through slide after slide about the WellReach Access Initiative, their flagship community outreach program. She called it her baby, claimed it was her vision, her design. I waited until she pulled up the impact graph and said, "This was built from the ground up under our new model." "Correction," I said, leaning forward. "That program was built under the original initiative, and I'd like to show you something." I tapped my tablet. A second later, the screen behind her switched. The original proposal filled the monitor. Hand-drawn maps, handwritten notes, grant goals, all dated. My name, in thick blue ink, sat squarely at the bottom. Drafted, signed, filed, silence. "That's the original framework for what is now called the WellReach Access Initiative," I continued, keeping my gaze on the board. "Everything from district prioritization to mobile clinic structure, it came from that first draft." Lorelei turned slowly toward the screen, her expression frozen. "That's outdated. We've evolved far past that." Janet spoke before I could respond. "Actually," she said, pulling out a folder of her own, "we've recently compared operational records. Most of the active components still mirror this blueprint. Very little has evolved, as you say." The weight in the room shifted, and then it cracked. "There's one more item we need to review," Janet added, sliding a second document to the center of the table. An internal audit flagged irregularities in the discretionary expense accounts. Everyone leaned in. "Flights to Aspen," she read. "Luxury hotel stays listed as community outreach. Designer eventwear categorized under public relations. All expenses logged under Lorelei's approval." My sister let out a small laugh, shrill, tight. "This is absurd. Those were strategic engagements. Visibility matters." "No one's questioning visibility," Mr. Whitaker said, frowning. "They're questioning integrity." Lorelei's face flushed, but she pressed her lips into a defiant line. "You're really going to let her manipulate this moment?" I didn't need to respond. The chairwoman did. "We've heard enough for today," she said calmly, then turned to me. "We'd like to offer you the position of lead advisor on health initiatives, effective immediately, full oversight." She paused, then turned to my sister. "And we're placing Lorelei on temporary leave pending a complete financial review." Lorelei stood so abruptly her chair skidded. Her eyes darted around the room, looking for a hand to grab, a face to plead with. No one met her gaze. I stood slowly. "I'm not here for revenge," I said, my voice even. "Just restoration." As the meeting wrapped, board members gathered their folders and filed out in quiet murmurs. Some gave me small nods as they passed, respectful but stunned. I stayed behind. The room emptied. The sun had climbed higher, spilling gold across the table's edge. I ran my hand along the wood, remembering the last time I'd stood outside this room, listening through the glass as they praised my sister's brilliance, quoting words I had written. Now I stood in the room they once kept locked. No shouting, no gloating, just quiet. "This was never about the spotlight," I murmured to myself. "Just the truth." I stepped toward the door. Behind me, the chairwoman handed an envelope to the assistant. "Have this sent to the full board," she said, "and make sure Lorelei receives her copy directly." As the assistant nodded and left, I followed close behind, the echo of my steps sharp and clean on the tile. The boardroom had emptied, but I stayed seated for a moment, staring at the chair my sister once used to tower from. I didn't raise my voice, but the echo of that moment followed them out the door. I could feel it, quiet power settling in, not loud like a gavel but steady like a heartbeat, and I knew I wouldn't go back to who I had been before this all began. 2 weeks later, I walked through the foundation's front entrance for the first time in nearly a year. No side door, no security badge hidden in my palm, just sunlight pouring through the tall windows and the receptionist looking up with a small, respectful nod. There, beneath the mission wall, a brushed brass plaque. It hadn't been there before. Founded by Elira Woodrow and the late Dr. Adam Woodrow. I paused in front of it. My fingers hovered just above the engraving before finally resting on the cool metal. My name, not hidden in archived grant proposals, not buried in internal notes. Out in the open, where it belonged. My throat tightened, but I held still. For once, I didn't feel the need to prove anything. The truth had already spoken for me. Back home that evening, I found a small envelope slipped through my front gate. My mother's handwriting. Sharp. Cold. "I hope you're happy now." That was it. No return address, no apology. Just those 5 words. It would have crushed me once. I'd spent years begging for acknowledgement, believing that if I just worked harder, loved deeper, bent further, something would shift. But some stories don't end with, "I'm sorry." They just end. My sister had vanished from public life after the audit. There was talk of restitution, pending review, her lawyer releasing vague statements about miscommunication. I didn't follow the coverage. I didn't need to. Silence was its own kind of confession. 3 days later, the rooftop garden opened under a pale morning sky. It had been part of the foundation's original wellness proposal, my idea, my sketches, but delayed, then discarded, then mysteriously reintroduced by committee consensus. Now it bloomed. I stood near the back as the ribbon was cut. A soft breeze lifted the lavender and mint leaves. Families walked slowly between raised beds, their hands brushing thyme and rosemary. Patients I hadn't seen in years approached quietly. One man pressed my hand and simply said, "Thank you." A teenage girl who'd once spent 6 months in our trauma program smiled at me and whispered, "It helped." Near the garden's center was a memorial stone, not large, not polished, just honest. In memory of Dr. Adam Woodrow, who believed healing meant more than medicine. A small boy, no older than 6, knelt and placed a daisy at its base. His mother gently guided him up, but the moment lingered. I blinked fast. The tears came anyway. I didn't want headlines, never did, just that simple, wordless honor. That child didn't know our history. He only knew this place helped someone he loved, and that was enough. I didn't take the CEO seat, declined it actually. Too many meetings, too much politicking. What I did accept was final authority over all health-related programming, every initiative, every line item. My fingerprints would be on what mattered, not on ceremony, and I began mentoring again. Just one young woman fresh out of grad school, full of fire but already second-guessing herself in rooms that didn't look like her. I handed her a thick folder and said, "If you think it's worth building, don't let them file it away. Build it." We met every Friday morning over coffee and timelines. She reminded me of me, before the war, before the paperwork, before the hurt, and that gave me more hope than any title could. One evening, as the sun dropped behind the rooftop trellises, I walked past the mirrored doors at the foundation's entrance, the same doors I'd once been blocked from. My reflection caught me off guard, not because I looked different, but because for the first time I recognized her. They had called me many things over the years, a fraud, a mistake, a placeholder, but the truth was, I was the foundation all along.